Welcome back to the last panel of our conference, which will deal with international perspectives from Europe and America to further contextualize this sometimes very unique Hungarian case. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker from Germany, Dr. Günther Jikeli, a professor of contemporary anti-Semitism at the Indiana University and a co-founder and vice chair of the International Institute for Education and Research on Anti-Semitism. Dr. Jikeli, do you hear us perfectly? Thank you.
Thank you.
Please hold your presentation.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's Jeffrey Kaplan who invited me to this conference. I'm looking forward to the other presentations, of course, and to the discussion. Let me share the screen and I will go over it of a short presentation for the next good 10 minutes. When we talk about Antisemitism Germany, this is, of course, in a context in Europe and with the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in the last 2 decades, I would say, and also with experiences of Jewish communities in different European countries that have increasingly felt being threatened by anti-Semitism, both physically as well as verbally. And we have seen a radicalization of anti-Semitic violence and anti-Semitic forms over the past 2 decades in Germany, but across Europe, in most European countries. We see that there are a number of factors that make Jews more likely to be targeted. Basically, if you're visibly Jewish, many countries, including Germany, it's likely that you face verbal and even physical attacks. So that's why many Jews try to hide their identity in public or even in schools, which is, of course, problematic for the Jewish communities in Germany, but this, I think, is true in many European countries. You have numbers of anti-Semitic incidents or anti-Semitic crimes. This is only a few countries actually have reliable numbers. The numbers for Germany are not as reliable as I would like to. So what we have here are what you see here are only crimes that are motivated by anti-Semitic ideologies, and these are numbers from the police, and they have annual statistics, but the actual number is much higher that we know from surveys where we ask Jewish community members if they reported any of the anti-Semitic incidents or crimes that they experienced, and often in a number of surveys there's about 75% do not report anti-Semitic incidents to any organization, including to Jewish organization, police, or whatever. So these numbers have to be seen with caution. And only in the last 3 years in Germany, there's a more differentiation on the background of perpetrators. But this is a very difficult business, and many countries have this problem, because often there are anti-Semitic incidents or anti-Semitic crimes, and you don't know actually who the perpetrator is, but you can have some indications about the political motivation. So in 2017, the police started recording also on foreign and religious-based motivations. But here are the numbers for the last 3 years again. So violent crimes make it about 3 to 4%, but violent crimes, of course, have a strong impact, not only directly to the victims, but also to the entire Jewish community. If you think of course, the terrorist attack in Halle, that threatens then, or has a feeling that there's not enough protection, and they are targeted across not only Germany but Europe. So these kind of violent incidents, terrorist attacks that we've seen early on in France, but they're also happening in Germany. So who are then perpetrators? By the numbers that we get from the police, the police has registered that, classifying it, saying about 90% or so is motivated by the far right, or political right, about 1% from the left, 4 to 9% by foreign or religious motivation, which is in this case mostly Muslim, and only very small number non-identified. This shows us already that there's an indication that many of the crimes where we see, for example, a swastika sprayed on a synagogue, very often automatically the police says this is from the political right. So we have to take these figures that we see here a little bit with care. And you see here for the violence, the numbers are a little bit different. So there's a high percentage that are in the category of foreign and religious. So that's between 12 and 20% in the numbers of UK. But if you ask victims, you get a different pictures. So if you do surveys with victims, this is from a big European survey done in 2018 by the European Union, funded by the European Union. And you see in the case of Germany, the biggest group of perpetrators are in fact identified by the victims as Muslim extremists, and only second, the political right, and third, the political left. And this varies by country. So in Hungary, the political right has many more of the victims identify the political right as perpetrators, but also the Christian extremists that do not play a large role in Germany. There is another such survey that was only focusing on Germany, and that was done in 2017, and they have roughly the same numbers. So we have a discrepancy here between when we ask the victims and when we see the numbers by police. And one of the possible explanations is that police automatically puts things that they don't identify. Many of those, they put this to the extreme right. This is where it has come in Germany from many decades to a large part. And I briefly want to go into the most violent anti-Semitic attack in recent years that you're probably all familiar with in Halle in 2019 on Yom Kippur. There was a terrorist who targeted this synagogue and wanted to, as he said, kill as many Jews as possible. He couldn't get into this synagogue. The door was locked, luckily, but he killed 2 passers-by. But this kind of rhetoric that the terrorist used is revealing. We see that he put this, what you see here, he published this on the internet, and he published this in English, and this is already an indication that there's an internationalization of this right-wing terrorist scene. And he put it in a way that we know from gaming, the way he did it, but he expressly said that he wants to kill as many, he put it anti-whites. So this comes from a white nationalist ideology, and says that Jews are main target, right? And you also see that he uses rhetoric that is referencing Israel in a way, or what he calls here ZOGS, Zionist occupied government. So the anti-Zionism is also parts of the right-wing extremists. They have this idea that Zionists or Jews run the governments in Germany or around the world, right? This classical anti-Semitic stereotype. And what I find shocking is some of the thinking of this terrorist seems to be also widespread in the general population. So his mother was asked a couple of days later, what does your son have against Jews? So the terrorist mother then said, he has a wrong vocabulary. It's nothing against Jews in that sense. It's something against the people who are behind the financial power who has not. A classical anti-Semitic stereotype. And when we look at surveys, we see that in the same months in Germany, about a quarter of the German population had similar ideas. Jews have too much power in international financial markets. So that makes it, puts the question to me, is it the extremists of the far right, left, or Muslim extremists that influence more mainstream population, or is it only acting out more violently on the fringes? So we see three main ideological sources of violent anti-Semitic crimes, but also everyday anti-Semitism. That's the extreme left with anti-Zionist rhetoric, and we saw that more and more, or again, very clearly in May this year. So Israel is demonized, and then Jews are suspected of supporting this that people see as an evil state. We see that it's coming from Islamists, and in Germany, the largest Muslim organization is DITIB, that is closely related to the Turkish government. And since Erdogan's rise to power, it has been increasingly Islamist. So there is also dissemination of Islamist propaganda in these mostly mainstream Muslim organizations that is more and more influenced by Islamism, and anti-Semitism is part and parcel of an Islamist worldview. Right, and then we have other organizations like Miligorish is the second largest one, and the leader, who is now deceased, was openly anti-Semitic. We also see it from the extreme right and the populist right, and they have of the history of Germany, and this is, they have basically, the populist far right has basically two themes. One is anti-immigrant, and the other one is to try to whitewash the national past. And this is something that we see also in countries like Hungary or Poland, but also in Germany, this revisionist agenda. And I think I will stop here, because we are supposed to be only 10 minutes, but I'm happy to expand on this later on. Good, and I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer them questions afterwards in the general discussion.
Thank you, Professor, for this presentation, and also that you were so kind to stick to the time frame. And I will also kindly ask all the other presenters to try to stick to the 10 to 15 minutes time frame as well. Our next speaker is going to be Marc Weissmann. He's a Paris-based journalist, activist, and the author of the book Hate: The Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism in France. Please, Mr. Weissman.
Thanks to everyone for having me. Just to correct one minor information, not that it's important, but I'm not an activist at all of any kind. I'm just a writer and a journalist. That's it. The situation in France has been particular in many ways. We have the privilege, in a way, of being the country that has known the worst terror wave in a European country since World War II in 2015, 2016. And it's somehow connected with the rise of anti-Semitism in the early 2000s. How it is connected is a complex issue. I'm going to try to give a few notions of what's been going on in France for the last 20 years. In January 2014, there was a demonstration in Paris called Day of Wrath that was a demonstration of a mix of far-right Catholic militants against the French government that was socialist at the time, and Salafist Muslims and activists of various kinds. During this demonstration, which was a far-right demonstration, you could hear the first anti-Semitic slogans in France since World War II that said, "Jew, France is not yours." In the following 3 months, you had a rise of anti-Semitic incidents in the Muslim suburbs, or in the mainly Muslim-populated suburbs. That was not directly connected to that demonstration, but it was like an echo of that demonstration. In May, in Brussels, you had the attack of the Jewish Museum of Brussels that killed 4 people. And during the summer, you had demonstrations against the Gaza war in all over the country, and especially in Paris, during which synagogues were attacked in some suburbs of Paris and in Paris itself, near Bastille. Meanwhile, the anti-Semitic incidents kept rising. At the end of the year 2014, 1 week before the Charlie Hebdo attack, the number of anti-Semitic incidents across the country, according to the Ministry of Interior, was 800 for a total Jewish population of 500,000 individuals. This means more than 2 anti-Semitic incidents a day. Then 1 week later, you had the Charlie Hebdo attack and the Hyper Kosher store attack, which started the terror campaign that lasted for 18 months, culminated with the Bataclan attack, and that left in all 236 dead across the country. So where does all that come from? France is facing a sort of convergence of various propagandas since the early 2000s. Like in Germany, like across Europe mostly, it comes from, at the same time, the far right, the far left, and the Muslim propaganda. It started really in the early 90s when Salafi activists from Algeria came to France in search of political asylum. Algeria was then the ground of a civil war that had started with the Islamists and that would leave 200,000 people dead at the end of the decade. France welcomed Salafi militants in the early 90s, and those militants began to set off the Muslim revolution that would change the Islam of France for good by the end of the decade. This is really the Muslims from Algeria, backed by the Saudis, that changed, that made Islam, the French Islam, a more Salafi-oriented Islam and more prone to anti-Western, anti-Jewish propaganda. This propaganda was directed in the 90s toward the suburbs and the lower classes of the Muslim population in France. Paralleling this propaganda, at the same time, you had a rebirth of the extreme right-wing discourse coming from the new right, the former new right of the 70s. Basically, what unites these two currents is the end of the Cold War. The main reason why Algeria plunged into a civil war in the early 90s was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Algeria was a socialist country, and as soon as the USSR disappeared, the country plunged into the civil war thanks to the Islamists that had fought the Red Army in Afghanistan, financially backed by the Saudis. On the other side of the political spectrum, right-wing extremists saw the end of the Cold War as a new opportunity to unite against the American and the global empire and international bankings. These militants, these far-right militants, saw an opportunity in a new kind of alliance between far-right nationalists of all kinds, if you will, far-right nationalists on the one hand, former communists on the other, and Muslim activists in Iran, especially. So people like Alain de Benoit, the former founder of the New Right in France, supported the Iranian Revolution and the Islamists in Algeria in the from the mid-80s on. One of his connections in Eastern Europe was Alexander Dugin. As soon as the Berlin Wall fell, Alexander Dugin came to Europe, Western Europe. He came to Paris to meet Alain de Benoit. He also met people like Claudio Muti, a neo-fascist Italian activist who converted to Islam in the mid-80s under the name of Omar Amin. And he also met Jean Tirya in Belgium. Jean Tirya was the former president of the Friends of the Great Reich during World War II, and he was the founder of most of the extreme post-fascist movements in Belgium after World War II. These people connected together, founded in France what is known in France as the Red-Brown Alliance, and they came to some sort of understanding, especially through Dugin, with the Iranian propaganda. This right-wing propaganda was directed not toward the suburbs, but toward intellectual circles, journalists, writers, and so forth. And to a point, it worked. It was never as dangerous, physically dangerous as the Muslim propaganda was, but it worked, because it helped creating some sort of background in the French intellectual landscape, in a background that was characterized by anti-American, anti-capitalist, an anti-capitalist discourse, if you will, that could appeal to the far left as well. The far left, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, fell orphaned, if you will. They had nothing to hold on to, and there was a nostalgia in France in the 90s, a nostalgia for high ideals, revolutionary spirits, a nostalgia to which the far right propaganda, properly managed, could respond. So those were the three cultural speeches, if you will, that converged to a common discourse against Israel, against America, and against against the global world, if you will, of the 90s. And this, in the early 2000s, these three discourses began to coalesce in a common narrative. The point of departure for that, of course, was the fall of the peace process in the Middle East on the one hand, and September 11 on the other. This was the signal that something could be done against the new global order. one of the French specificity, those three currents, far right, far left, and Islamism, are not specific to France, but one of the French specificity is the connection between the far right and some sort of Jewish fantasy, because we have in France a Sephardic population that is demographically more important than the Ashkenazis were by tradition in France. What we call the Sephardis in France are people coming from the former colonies in France. And these Sephardics are more inclined to a certain understanding toward the far right. So this French situation is a little bit complicated because of that. There's this notion that if the main enemy being the Muslims, Jews and the far right could unite to fight Muslims, because in fact, yes, the Muslims are the more physically dangerous right now in the country. So we have, I would say, I will stop there, but I will stop here. But basically, the situation in France is made more confusing because of that element, because of the temptation from the far right to support Israel against the Muslims, against the Arab countries, the temptation of a certain part of the Jewish community to ally itself with the far right, while the anti-Semitic discourse of the far right is still going on. Meanwhile, so this makes the situation at this point more confusing than it could be perhaps in other countries. I'm not sure, but certainly the terror wave that we've known has made everyone more nervous, everyone more scared of what's coming, and what we're expecting right now in the coming year is renewal of tension due to the trials of the attacks of November 2015 on the one hand, and the presidential campaign that's going to start at the same time, basically. So we expect a renewal of tension against the Jews, basically. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Rabbi Andrew Baker, Director of International Jewish Affairs at the American Jewish Committee.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, if only virtually, today. I'd like to just offer some rather general reflections on the challenge, the problem of anti-Semitism, as well as the experience, essentially, of getting governments, international organizations to address the problem as well. And I want to reflect not only on my work for many years with the American Jewish Committee, but also serving now since 2009 as a special envoy of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It is really 20 years ago this summer, and many people point to the UN Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa, as a kind of turning point when we look at the resurgence of anti-Semitism that really marks now almost these 2 decades. That was a conference where Jewish organizations initially had sought, I would say, simply to ensure that anti-Semitism was identified as one of the longstanding forms of racism, but instead the conference itself almost became a place for fomenting anti-Semitism. It saw the renewal of the Zionism is racism canard, and accompanied as it was by a breakdown of the peace process in the Middle East. Shortly thereafter, we saw a surge in anti-Semitic incidents, mostly in Western Europe. Anti-Semitic incidents that initially governments themselves were slow to identify or recognize, or perhaps even more troubling, intentionally chose not to recognize them. It led eventually to significant international efforts. The conferences organized by the OSCE, a first conference on anti-Semitism by an international organization, which took place 2003 in Vienna, followed by a high-level conference in Berlin a year later, a declaration in which all of these OSCE participating states asserted that anti-Semitism had taken on new forms and manifestations. It did state, largely in a way to refute what we had been hearing from some governments, that events in the Middle East, incidents in Israel, could never justify anti-Semitism. Of course, we saw how they were at least being pointed to as ways of rationalizing or excusing this increase in incidents. So where are we now, literally almost 2 decades later? And I think we find ourselves in a challenging situation, in one where there's a genuine, I would say, puzzle as to, while if we looked at this in a kind of split screen, we would be able to say, and I'll share briefly what these are, significant positive measures taken by governments, by international bodies and organizations to address the problem of anti-Semitism. And yet that other split screen shows us, and I think the people who are here speaking and listening today know all too well, that that problem has not diminished. If anything, it seems even more acute and more challenging and multifaceted. The fact is, we see anti-Semitism coming from various places. They've been already identified by previous speakers, but just to recount, we see anti-Semitism coming from the far right, an anti-Semitism that we know quite well, we've been addressing for years, but it remains strong, and in some cases even stronger than it was some years back, as disillusion with the European Union, with anti-immigrant activity in Europe and in America, feeding racist, white supremacist movements that are inherently anti-Semitic. We see anti-Semitism coming from the political left, not always and perhaps not frequently taking violent form, but a pernicious form as well that challenges often Jews' own place in political and social movements on the progressive left. We see that playing out these days in the United States. We saw it reach a kind of high point, if you will, or low point with the anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism being expressed in the British Labour Party under the chairmanship of Jeremy Corbyn. We've seen as well over these years, and as our previous speaker identified, and as various people in different Western European countries know all too well, significant incidents of anti-Semitism coming from parts of the Arab and Muslim communities, an anti-Semitism that has at times taken even lethal forms, but one that is expressed frequently and on a day-to-day basis in the form of physical or verbal harassment that makes the comfort, the day-to-day sustainability of Jewish life being challenged. We've seen how anti-Semitism has been folded into efforts to confront the Holocaust-era history, notable in a country like Hungary, but in Hungary's neighbors as well. A significant development in the 1990s, early 2000s, in pushing these countries to confront critically, directly, their Holocaust-era history. Much of this folded into efforts to secure the restitution of Jewish property, of communal and private property. Anti-Semitism played a role here. The honoring of fascist-era leaders, perhaps inspiring national identity, but individuals who themselves were complicit, active participants in the Holocaust in various countries. And while there was a record really of international historical commissions and other vehicles to address this problem, we've seen now in more recent years that has almost been pushed aside. One cannot argue this is out of ignorance anymore, but we see a revival of these fascist era figures being honored in various countries in Central and Eastern Europe, countries where Jewish communities themselves are the very victims or children and grandchildren of the victims of these perpetrators. We see another form, a real challenge to Jewish life, maybe not anti-Semitic by intent, but in many ways still anti-Semitic in effect. I speak now about efforts to restrict or ban long-standing religious practices essential for Jews and in many cases for Muslims as well, namely the practice of Brit Milah, of circumcision, and of Shechita, of religious slaughter. Often these are movements led by human rights activists, people who are arguing we're concerned only about the protection of animals or to secure the rights and protection of children. But we've seen in multiple countries a success in banning the practice of religious slaughter and movements now to ban circumcision as well. Again, you take all of these together and where or if they succeed, they really do pose a very real, even existential challenge to the future sustainability of Jewish communities in these countries. These are the multiple problems we face. At the same time, we've seen over these last 2 decades remarkable positive developments in getting governments to take up this problem to address these issues. Security has been and remains a critical issue for Jewish communities. It is one that is never truly settled, and I think we even recognize that no one wants to imagine that permanent Jewish life has to exist behind fortified walls and armed guards. Nevertheless, many of the attacks we were witnessing during the first decade of this millennium were taking place because governments were slow or unwilling to really step forward and offer the security necessary. That is today far less the case. We can still ask for more, we can still understand more may need to be done, but nevertheless, these days governments recognize this. It's part of recommendations and decisions issued by the OSCE, by the European Union, and by various national governments. We've seen a growth of identifying and appointing individuals with a specific responsibility in their national governments to implement action plans to address anti-Semitism. We've seen the adoption and use now of the working definition of anti-Semitism, initially developed with the European Monitoring Center 15 years ago, but since 2016 identified as the IRA working definition, the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a tool really that can help police, prosecutors, monitors understand anti-Semitism in its multiple forms, and hopefully by understanding it, beginning to properly address it. That definition to some degree remains controversial, but in fact it has become a formal adopted definition by nearly 30 countries, numerous organizations, sports teams and others. and is a significant tool to educate the general public as well on the anti-Semitism that we face. We have a much sharper and clearer experience now in identifying and measuring anti-Semitism. Surveys conducted by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, other civil society organizations as well, giving us a clearer, a sharper picture of the problem, and certainly of how Jews themselves see and experience this. All of this is really quite a remarkable and positive development. Nevertheless, we're facing many of the same challenges, and perhaps in even a more acute form than we did looking back now 15 to 20 years ago. Perhaps we might conclude that were there not such efforts undertaken by governments, the problem would be even more severe. One cannot really know that, but we surely have our work cut out for us today. And to add one more point that I think we all have come to recognize, even if there's great effort and involvement on the part of governments in addressing anti-Semitism, we see all too frequently that challenge, that fight against anti-Semitism itself has become politicized. Those on the left only willing, maybe too willing, to point to the problem on the right while ignoring what happens in their own camp. Those who have a real challenge in confronting that Holocaust era history, pointing instead to the challenge of Muslims attacking Jews elsewhere in Europe. I think we see here in the United States, where for so very long the fight against anti-Semitism, against racism and intolerance had always been a common bipartisan effort, is now as well become a tool of our hyper-partisan political arena. So even if address push national bodies to take it up and address the challenge themselves are so much more serious. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Baker, for this speech. Our next presenter will be Professor Xiao Madd, a distinguished fellow in Jewish studies at Dartmouth College, US.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Jeff, for inviting me. My role in this panel is to offer some brief observations about anti-Semitism in America today. In many ways, it's a daunting task, in part because the very term anti-Semitism, or what constitutes anti-Semitism, is a hotly debated issue, something that I will return to below. In fact, the question of definition, something that the previous speaker had alluded to, as we see in the IRA document or the Jerusalem document, rather than the thing itself, may be the central issue in America today. Much has been written about recent anti-Semitic acts, the most horrific being the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in October 2018, when 11 Jews were murdered by a single gunman during Sabbath services. But even given this unspeakable tragedy, we should consider, and I would argue distinguish, between this act and others like it and the rise of the so-called problem of anti-Semitism in America. This is not to suggest that this wasn't an anti-Semitic act. Of course it was. Rather, it's to suggest that there's an important distinction to be made between an anti-Semitic act or an anti-Semite who acts out his or her hatred for Jews and anti-Semitism as a societal problem. In the 1970s, Jewish historian and Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg wrote that, quote, "For all intents and purposes, there is no anti-Semitism in America." And a half century earlier, in the 1920s, constitutional lawyer Lewis Marshall wrote, and I quote, "We do not recognize the existence of a Jewish question in the United States." In my brief remarks today, I would like to examine and in fact justify both of these statements with some important qualifications, by trying to distinguish between anti-Semitic actors and anti-Semitism as a societal, even systemic problem that requires acute intervention. And here is why I think much of what is being written today, certainly in more popular venues, about the problem of anti-Semitism is misguided. In many of these studies, the problem of anti-Semitism is judged by the existence of anti-Semitic actors, be they violent, verbal, or silent. For example, a Jew verbally being accosted on the street, or anti-Semitic graffiti on subways, buses, and thoroughfares, which in America is still fairly rare and certainly not tolerated. Books have appeared recounting anti-Semitic events, claiming that these acts prove the problem. But before continuing, I want to ask a question. If that is the problem, that is, if the problem is that there are anti-Semites, what do these authors who call out these acts seek to achieve? Is the intended goal to eradicate the existence of anti-Semites? That would be as absurd as aspiring to eradicate racists. People will always hate other people for all kinds of reasons. James Baldwin remarked when asked about Black anti-Semitism in the 1960s, and I quote, "Everybody hates everybody," Baldwin said. "The only question is power." And in his book Notes of a Native Son, published in 1955, he wrote, and again I quote, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." In other words, there's no real way to eradicate hatred. It's no surprise to anyone here that, like all haters, anti-Semites will always exist. If so, then what is the goal? One could say that the goal is to eradicate social tolerance of anti-Semitism in the public square and limit it in private places as much as possible. In that case, the Pittsburgh massacre was both an act of anti-Semitism and a tragedy that showed why there is so little tolerance for it in America. Communities in America from the far left to the far right may be an exemption, reached out to help the families of Pittsburgh's victims. For example, Muslim activist Linda Sarsour, an American of Palestinian descent, often considered by some to be anti-Semitic because of her critique of Israel, raised money from the American Muslim community to pay for all of the funerals of all of Pittsburgh's victims. This, I think, is what Hertzberg meant when he said in the 1970s that there is essentially no anti-Semitism in America. That is, there are anti-Semites who act, but there is little or no social tolerance for those actions. I think he was right in the 1970s, and he is largely still correct today. A politician in America who makes an openly anti-Semitic remark will be castigated, and his or her political career will be in peril. Subtler remarks, such as Trump saying that he wants men with yarmulkes counting his money, are harder to judge, as our comments say of how blacks can jump or that Asians are good at math. These are stereotypes that sociologist Earl Rabb called instances of folk anti-Semitism, or negative stereotypes that permeate all societies, and not just about Jews. There's a distinction to be made between those who hold such stereotypes, and arguably we all do to some extent, as they're part of social conditioning, and real racists, anti-Semites, and bigots. These stereotypes, often held by people who would never support, for example, anti-Semitic policies, does not, according to Rabb, constitute the problem of anti-Semitism. The problem arises when folk anti-Semitism rises to the realm of the political, when negative stereotypes become the source of exclusionary legislation, policies, or social tolerance. In his essay, The Black Revolution and the Jewish Question, Earl Rabb further notes, and I quote, "There are three obvious conditions that coincide to produce a period of political anti-Semitism. The kind of political and social instability which makes anti-Semitism useful, a political leader who is willing to use it, and a mass population that is willing to embrace it, end quote. This suggests yet another distinction worth mentioning, that is, being complicit in anti-Semitic policies as a political reality needn't require one to be an anti-Semite. This is behind some of the criticisms of Jonah Goldhagen's 1996 Hitler's Willing Executioners. Were German or Polish citizens who went along with the anti-Semitic policies necessarily anti-Semites? They certainly held negative stereotypes of Jews, but to use Rab's term, the shift from the folk to the political was not necessarily their initiative, but the decisions of others. Their complicity is certainly remarkable and tragic, but openly opposing such views was also quite dangerous. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a classic victim of that danger. At any rate, according to Lewis Marshall's comment that the absence of the Jewish question, which in post-emancipated Europe has been considered the engine that generated a rise in anti-Semitism, the American context for Jews never quite had the same texture as it did in Europe. Jews never fought for emancipation in America. They arrived on its shores emancipated. It is true that Peter Stuyvesant wanted to refuse entry Jews to New Amsterdam, later to become New York, but his resistance failed. Perhaps the history really begins not with Stuyvesant, but with George Washington's gracious letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, where he wrote, evoking scriptural imagery, and here I'm quoting from Washington's letter: "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. May the children of the stock of Abraham," referring to the Jews, "who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." End quote. By and large, America has lived up to Washington's aspirational comment, at least regarding its Jews. There were certainly times when its elasticity was tested in Henry Ford's publication of The International Jew in the 1920s, the anti-Semitic radio broadcasts of Father Charles Coughlin in the 1930s, and with the Cold War battle against communism marked by the Rosenberg trial in the 1950s. But in each case, and there were many others, the political realm held firm, helped by constitutional rights and the courts. Open anti-Semitism never became public policy in America. In the early 2000s, when Joe Lieberman was chosen to be Al Gore's running mate for vice president, there were murmurs that his Jewishness would become a political liability. It didn't. And in 2016, when Bernie Sanders ran on a ticket of democratic socialism, Jews feared an anti-Semitic backlash. There wasn't. In short, these events or figures never moved folk anti-Semitism, which has always and will always exist to some extent, into political anti-Semitism, which would actually threaten the Jews. If we move closer to our times, a number of important things have changed, three of which are worth mentioning. First is the question of Israel, especially after 1967. The second is the distancing of the Holocaust as an event that evoked tremendous sympathy from many Americans, such that there was support in the late 1970s, initiated by President Carter, to establish a Holocaust Memorial Museum on the sacred American landscape of the Washington Mall. One should not underestimate the significance of that decision, not the museum itself, there are many Holocaust museums, but its place on the mall buttressed by the Washington and Lincoln memorials. And third is the new articulation of race, or perhaps better put, anti-Blackness, and in particular Jewish whiteness, or the question of Jewish whiteness, that has emerged in light of critical race theory. The individual who murdered 11 Jews in Pittsburgh chose that synagogue because it was the center of Hayas, a historically progressive Jewish organization that today helps facilitate immigration from countries in Africa. This is not to say the act was not anti-Semitic. It is to say that the complexity of anti-Semitism and racism in America is more nuanced than we are often led to believe. Pittsburgh was not only an anti-Semitic act, it was also a racist act. It's no accident, for example, that 2 of the 3 freedom riders who were murdered by white supremacists in June 1964 were Jews. Michael Schwimmer and Andrew Goodman, the 2 Jews who were lynched by white supremacists in 1964, were not killed because they were Jews. They were killed because they were helping blacks. Regarding Israel, perhaps the first formal iteration of a shift was a locution added to the proceedings of the New Left's New Politics conference in September 1967 in Chicago, a mere 2 months after the Six-Day War. The New Politics Conference was a national conference of the New Left that included the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS, the Black National Caucus, and many others. Martin Luther King gave one of its keynote addresses. On the recommendation of the Black Caucus, a statement opposing, quote, Zionist colonial exploitation was added. To the consternation of many Jewish New Leftists at the time. King also claimed that he did not know of this addition and would not have agreed to speak had he known it. This was in many ways a first salvo of black nationalist third worldism against Israel that would continue to have an impact in later decades as the occupation grew into its present state of de facto annexation. More recently, especially after 9/11 and the rise of negative attitudes towards Muslims in America in its wake, evangelical Christians increasingly saw Israel as the front line in the global fight against Islamist terrorism. This has moved from a political into a theological realm whereby Israel increasingly became viewed as a necessary phase in the second coming of Christ and the fulfillment of the prophecies in the book of Revelation. This can be seen even before 9/11 in Jerry Jacobs and Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series, a pulp fiction depiction of Christian dispensationalism, and later John Hagee's evangelical Christian Zionist movement. This ostensible philo-Semitism or philo-Israelism comes at a theological price. The book of Revelation, as we know, does not end well for the Jews. But Israeli officials, especially in its dominant right-wing government, have cynically deflected dispensationalist theology and are willing to pay that price as it gives them much-needed leverage and financial support. It's no accident that Hagee was invited to give the invocation at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, where his mention of Jesus was quietly tolerated by noticeably uncomfortable ultra-Orthodox Jews sitting in the audience. Thus, the progressive left, increasingly viewing Israel as an extension of white American imperialism in its treatment of Palestinians, and the white nationalist right, increasingly viewing Israel as the stepping stone of its own ethnocentric project, for example, in white nationalist Richard Spencer's Positive Views of Israel, in addition to its own theological aspirations of Armageddon, has made Israel, the Jews, and thus anti-Semitism and anti-anti-Semitism a wedge issue in today's polarized political climate. White nationalists applaud Israel because they see in it an ethno-nationalist state they want to produce in America. Richard Spencer made that quite explicit. On the other hand, progressives on the left, are anti-Israel because they view that ethno-nationalism as a source of its racism against Arabs. The issue for me is not to judge whether, in fact, white nationalists or left progressives are correct in their assessment, only here to describe the contours of the ideological map and its implications. It may be because of the contentious debate about Israel that the main issue in America today regarding anti-Semitism is about definitions and not about anti-Semitism itself. And the debate of definitions is not really about anti-Semitism per se, but about the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. This is where the IRA and the Jerusalem document differ most sharply. That is arguably the crux of the debate about anti-Semitism today. It is not about social tolerance of anti-Semitism, but social tolerance of anti-Israelism, for example, tolerance of BDS. It's quite easy and convenient to say anyone who is against Israel is against the Jews. If you say that Israel is not only a Jewish state, but the state of the Jewish people, even though more than half the world's Jewish population do not reside in that state, one can arguably say that to be against Israel, and that itself requires considerable clarification, is anti-Semitic. And Israel often defines itself as the state of the Jewish people, even though most Jews are citizens of nations other than that state. When Benjamin Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett claim not only to be the prime minister of the citizens of the state of Israel, but the prime minister of the Jewish people, they feed into that anti-Semitic claim. By collapsing Jewishness with Israel, we leave open the connection that opposing one is opposing the other. And here, ironically, Zionists and anti-Semites make a similar assumption. But many Jews, even many Jews who support Israel, do not want their identity as Jews to be inextricably intertwined with Israel. On this reading, Jewish progressives who are highly critical of Israel but want to retain a commitment to Zionism in some form often find it difficult to secure a place in the progressive world, in part because progressives have in some way bought into the narrative that Israel and the Jews are one thing. And white evangelical supporters of Israel have done the same thing. Their ostensible philo-Semitism in their pro-Israelism is based on the same principle. Thus, Jewish critics of Israel are viewed by many of these white evangelicals as bad Jews and justifiably targets of animus one might call anti-Semitism. Here then, anti-Semitism is arguably directed at Jews who support Israel by progressives who view Israel as an arm of white imperialism, and by Christian Zionists who view Jews who don't support Israel as preventing the unfolding of the second coming of Christ. In this way, Israel is a nation state of all its citizens like all states, but a state that also claims to be the state of a people, most of whom do not reside there. This has created a confusing paradigm on the question of anti-Semitism in America. As elsewhere in modernity, anti-Semitism was mostly about Jews in the environs where they lived. Lewis Marshall claimed there was no Jewish question in America because Jewish inclusion in the American project, as we saw in Washington's letter, never posed a problem. And Arthur Hertzberg claimed there was really no anti-Semitism in America, that is, no problem of anti-Semitism, because while anti-Semitic actors exist and sometimes act on their own hatred, there was and remains little tolerance for such behavior in America. The question of Israel confuses the calculus because it both widens and narrows the definition of the Jew. It widens it by suggesting the Jew is also defined by affiliation with a state, and it narrows it by defining the Jew only defined through affiliation with the state. So in sum, it may be impossible today to separate the question of anti-Semitism from the question of Israel in America. This is in part because American Jews cannot figure out what to do with Israel in relation to their identities as Jews, and in part because Americans more generally, progressive and conservative, have allowed Israel to become the barometer by which it understands the American Jew. And finally, the American Jew has not figured out how to relate to anti-Semitism. Is it circumstantial? Is it historical? Or is it ontological? That is it a problem that can be resolved, or is it endemic to the nature of human civilization? Too many, I believe, act as if it is the former two, but believe that is really the latter. And if it's the latter, meaning if anti-Semitism is a form of ontology, there is nothing save divine intervention that can accomplish anything except managing Jewish anxiety about anti-Semitism. But rabbinic teaching tells us that it's forbidden to depend on a miracle. And so we remain mired in the unfortunate state of self-serving categories that prevent us from even getting to the crux of the problem, which, at least in America, may not be a systemic societal problem in need of radical intervention. And that itself may raise anxiety for some Jews, which of course is another problem entirely. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Magid. And now please welcome Mr. Marek.
This
Kucia,
meeting is being recorded.
Director of the Institute of Sociology at the Jagiellonian University, Krakow.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm very glad to be participating at this conference, and thank you very much for inviting me. Special thanks to Professor Kaplan for extending this invitation to me. I'm meant to speak about Poland, but it's a pretty wide topic, so I've chosen to discuss just some aspects of anti-Semitism in Poland. I will not discuss various anti-Semitic or philo-Semitic acts which take place in this country, except when alluding to what is the focus of my talk. That is public opinion and anti-Semitic views. Most of us are familiar with the research carried out by the Anti-Defamation League in over 100 countries right now. And one of the conclusions of this research can be seen in this article, in the title of this article. The picture, unfortunately, is not about Poland, it's about Hungary, but Poland featured the worst among the countries covered in that wave of the ADL survey in Eastern Europe alongside Hungary. I'm going to discuss the results of a survey which I and my team designed, the survey which was carried out last year in the autumn. And what I'm focused on is the agreement and disagreement of Poles with various anti-Semitic beliefs. So that's the level of anti-Semitism that I'm going to address. That's the beliefs which are presented to our respondents and their reaction, agreement or disagreement with those. And in one or two occasions, I'll be referring to some earlier research on the same matters. But before I start, let me highlight a few facts about Poland, and primarily about Poland's Jews. We all know that there was a huge Jewish community before the war in Poland. Over 3 million people. That was almost 10% of the country's population at that time. And that was one of the largest Jewish communities in the world at that time. At present, there are just a few thousand Jews living in Poland, and we can use various sources to document that. And I'm using the census of Poland's population from 10 years ago. There's actually a census going on right now. So we shall see in a couple of months when the census is over, when the data is published, what the changes we have here. And that was self-declared ethnic identity. You could state one or two, right? So from among the multiple identities that people may have, the authors of the census allowed us to choose up to 2 ethnic or national identities. 7,500 individuals self-declared Jewish identity in that census, and 1,600 of them Jewish only, and 5,400 Jewish and Polish. And there were also some declaring Jewish and some other identity, people from other countries, Jewish people from other countries living in Poland. Religious Jews, according to this survey, to this census, there were 764 people who declared belonging to the Jewish religion. But according to other data, the data which are provided by the Jewish religious organizations, this should be at least twice as many. That's the Jewish population of Poland, and the overall Poland's population. There are a few stereotypes. One of them is actually true, that Poland is ethnically almost homogeneous. According to the census from 10 years ago, 95% of the population of this country declared exclusively Polish ethnicity, and 2% more declared the Polish and another ethnicity. So there are hardly any countries like that in the world which would be as homogeneous ethnically as Poland is. There is another stereotype about Poland, that all Poles are Catholic. Not all Poles are Catholic. And according to the church, the Roman Catholic Church's statistics, 85% of the population of Poland were baptized in the Roman Catholic Church, and they are in the church's registers. But according to the count, which the church does once a year of those who attend the Holy Masses on a Sunday, it's only 37% in 2019 of those who are obliged to attend, of the Catholics who are obliged to attend, who actually did attend, who practice the religion, if you like. There are other ways of measuring religiosity in Poland, and they all show the decline in this aspect of Poland's society. There are fewer people baptized in the Catholic Church and fewer attending the church, and increasingly critical of the church itself, etc. So that's the background. I will be talking about what the Poles think, what the Poles believe regarding various anti-Semitic views. And it's good to bear in mind this sort of statistics behind what sort of respondents we had. Mostly ethnically Polish, and many of them, the vast majority of them being Catholic, but very few of those Catholics, only a third roughly, practicing the religion. All right, so that's the items which we asked a couple of items. Some of them we designed ourselves. Others we just cut and pasted from other surveys in order to have some comparison. This is the items I'll be showing, the results I'll be showing. The items were asked in this order as I will be showing the results. And it's quite important because you may have a question order effect. Some earlier questions and answers may affect the answers given in some later questions. So that was the first question which we asked. It actually corresponds with the view of the safety of the Jews living in Poland or coming to Poland, which the Jews themselves have, right? With the Fundamental Rights Agency, which has been referred to by some of my co-speakers in this panel, they ask a question like this to the members of the Jewish community in various countries. And the members of the Jewish community, some 400 of them, which were questioned in Poland, they did not report many anti-Jewish incidents at the time when the survey was done, which doesn't mean that there are not such incidents, but there are fewer of them than in other countries. And the perception of this by the ethnic Polish population is more or less similar. Now, this is a question which we asked because the main subject of our survey was the memory of Auschwitz and the Holocaust, and we wanted to know what sort of perception the discussing of crimes, alleged crimes committed by Poles on Jews during the Holocaust has, and that's how people reacted. The almost two-thirds of Poland's population get annoyed when they hear what this sort of view may stir. Now, another item which we designed ourselves was this. We wanted to know how what is the general perception of the Jews by the Poles. Whether the Jews are the evil people in the Polish perception or not. And we found the population of the country divided on this issue, as you can see. Further, we also inquired about what other surveys did. The perception of too much Jewish influence in the world, which is taken by a lot of authors who do surveys of anti-Semitic opinion as one of the markers of anti-Semitism. And we found actually what the ADL found about Poland in asking similar items. They didn't ask exactly the same item, but a similar item. More than a half of Poland's population harbor this anti-Semitic view. And we can actually compare how those views changed over time, because we happen to have the data for other from earlier surveys, and you can see that it's been the agreement with this statement was almost always as high, except 2010, which was almost 10% points lower. So that's more or less constant view of on that matter in Poland. We also asked a question with which sociologists in Poland asked quite a lot, and we found this unexpected result. We actually expected this agreement, the agreement with the statement, being much higher, as in the previous surveys. Right? That's the comparison of the adult parts of our sample with the adults asked in earlier surveys, and you can actually see the decline. Sorry, the increase in disagreement and a slight decline in the agreement with this between the survey carried out 10 years ago. We may actually see a kind of an influence of the perception of the current government by the population of this country. As you know, Poland is ruled by a right-wing populist government, and there is also a right-wing nationalistic president who won the second term last year using, among others, anti-Semitic propaganda in his campaign. The government is perceived by its supporters, who are at the level of some 30 or 40% right now, as a very Polish government, and hence perhaps this sort of change of opinion between 10 years ago and now. Okay. This is an item which has been asked, a similar item has been asked quite a bit in various surveys. In our survey, we contextualized it in the context of the Second World War and the Holocaust. We didn't want to have a general view on what people believe about gods punishing Jews for the crucifixion of Christ, but we wanted to view this in the context of the war, the Holocaust, of which we asked in our surveys a lot. And we actually got similar answers, and we may interpret this as a pretty low level of anti-Semitism, but it's still, frightening that as many as 11% of Poland's population would agree with this view, particularly since the vast majority of Poland's Jews, the vast majority of the 3 million Jews lost their lives in the Holocaust. It's reckoned that some 85%, 2.7 million of Polish Jews were killed in the Holocaust, and also because the Holocaust of other Jews than the Polish Jews mostly also happened in Poland. This sort of view is still quite widespread in the country. And this is one of the questions which very few social researchers are afraid of asking, but we weren't too afraid to ask it. And I would say this result is even more terrifying than the previous results. To have 1 in 5 of the polls agreeing with the statement is frightening, and it's too bad. And I believe that the years of efforts to conduct Holocaust education in Poland, to invite people, the ethnic Poles, to discuss what happened to the Jews in this country, I think that's been very inefficient, the time and the effort. This is an item which pertains to the issue of the competition in suffering, something which has been very much debated in Poland over the past decades, and which is an issue characteristic of also other Central and East European nations. And this is what we found. But I think it's good to see this result in a sort of diachronic perspective. Since this question was asked for the first time in 1992, we had a huge decline in the belief that that was the Jews who suffered more than the Poles. We had a steady increase in the view that the Polish nation was the one which suffered the more. But the majority, as we see, is that both suffered the same. That's the view which is prevailing in Polish society these days. You may interpret it in various ways. A common historical discourse on this matter has been in Poland that 6 million Polish citizens were killed in the Second World War, 3 million Poles and 3 million Jews. And this sort of standard historical narrative would justify this 53% level of answers. But if you look deeper into this data, this figure 6 million has been constructed, and it's not accurate. And the 3 million ethnic Poles is not accurate. The recent research by historians, the critical research by historians, including from the Institute of National Remembrance, proved that there were not as many as 3 million ethnic Poles, maximum 2 million and 1 million of Polish citizens of other than Polish or Jewish nationality. And also the awareness of the Holocaust of almost 3 million of Jews, plus almost 3 million of Jews from other countries, has grown in this country, as our research and other researchers have shown, but this is not reflected in this question. The view that Poles suffered at least as much as the Jews is pretty widespread. This is all I had to say. I should give credit to the various people and also the funding grant giving institution, which is the Polish National Science and Polish taxpayers' money, which funded the research, whose results I could share with you in this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Kucia. And the last presenter will be Sebastian Rejak, Director of the AJC Central Europe. And after his presentation, there will be time for questions.
Hello, jó napot kívánok. Thank you so much for your invitation. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. I would like to offer what I think will be a bird's eye view of the situation in Central Europe when it comes to anti-Semitism. So I will focus on this part of Europe, but at the same time, I want to make a reference to what Professor Magid has said, and I basically will be asking the question whether there is acceptance in Central Europe for anti-Semitic views and anti-Semitic acts. Let me start with briefly analyzing the very title of the conference. We're supposed to focus on appearance and reality when we talk about anti-Semitism in Hungary, but also from a wider perspective, the Central European perspective. So what I see in the very title is some sort of a tension, maybe even juxtaposition. So to what extent appearance is reflected in reality, to what extent reality confirms appearance, what is the appearance to start with? And I think there are at least two kinds of appearance that are opposed to one another. One is that Central Europe has been historically, traditionally, has been anti-Semitic. That it's the cradle of European anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism is a visible, palpable characteristic of Central Europe's culture. This is what people in Central Europe very often think that the West thinks of them. So in Central Europe, a lot of people fear that that's the image Western Europe and the West in general has of them when it comes to anti-Semitism. The second thing is like an automatic a knee-jerk reaction to that in Central Europe. And that reaction is very often about trying to prove that anti-Semitism is today just a marginal phenomenon, specifically if compared to Western Europe, or recently also to the US. The reactions we often hear would be, there are no burning synagogues here, Jews are not being murdered on our streets, Jewish schools do not need to be guarded by heavily armed police. And this is actually a fair point. This is a fact that it's hard to deny, but it's definitely not a full picture. So what's missing in the picture? What's missing in this perception or self-perception of anti-Semitism in Central Europe by a lot of people in Central Europe, including by decision makers? What is missing is just all the rest of the picture, and that's an important part of reality. It's the media, social media, the political discourse, political and administrative decisions. And let me give you a few examples, or rather allude to certain aspects of that. We have seen over the last couple of years people sharing anti-Semitic views or using dog whistling in a way that makes it clear they are talking about Jews. These people, sometimes such people are employed by government or local government agencies. They are appointed to mid and high-ranking positions in government or in scholarly institutions, these institutions that deal with, let's say, broadly understood culture, the humanities, and historical research in particular. Then we have people who belong to political establishments who publish opinion pieces or make public statements that include anti-Semitic statements or allude to anti-Semitic stereotypes. For example, calling someone a ruthless Hungarian and a ruthless American. This is the kind of language that everybody in Central Europe, but also beyond Central Europe, understands. When you hear this, you know that this is an allusion to Jews and this very popular and still widespread stereotype of the Jew. Then the media. I know the topic of media and popular culture has already been covered, so I will not be going too much into detail. What I want to underscore is the question of state-funded media. And I think we would all agree that this is a major challenge today in at least some of the Central European countries. The language that state-funded media is using when talking about minorities, but Jews in particular, and again, quite often the language uses dog whistling. So Jews may not be called by their name. There may be references to Zionists or Zionism as an ideology. You can hear the media talk about the international bankers groups or bankers lobbying groups. Sometimes media engages in spreading messages that use even traditional folk anti-Semitic tropes. And this is something that we have seen in Central Europe, particularly frequently during elections campaigns, including in Poland last year. So that's something that is very concerning, and because a lot of people tend to shape their worldviews on what they see in the media, what they are fed by the media. That is such an important issue and such a big challenge. I have mentioned the media as an instrument of communication that reaches the masses. I have mentioned instances of people holding mid to high-ranking public offices, but there's also the grassroots level, which is no less important. Sometimes that's where the problems are coming from. Sometimes the grassroots level is simply on the receiving end and is then responding or echoing what people on the grassroots level see in the media. What we keep seeing, what we keep witnessing on this basic level is there's still a lot of disrespect for Jewish heritage and a lack of proper inclusive education. I have to admit at the same time that there is a growing number of NGOs and activists and individuals who are very sensitive to Jewish or other non-majority cultural heritage, and there has been a growing number of initiatives, organizations whose tasks are to help preserve that heritage. So I want to make sure that that this is not overlooked. It's definitely there, and it's something that was not part of the landscape 20 or 30 years ago, or to a much lesser degree. That being said, the NGOs themselves, or the NGOs exclusively, are not able of taking upon their shoulders the whole burden of reaching hundreds of thousands of school children, let's say. They're unable of reaching thousands of school children with their programs. However magnificent those programs may be, there are simply not enough people to be doing that. And of course, the governments themselves have that on their shoulders. So we cannot, and we should not even expect NGOs and civil society to replace governments or to take over from governments that super important task of doing the educational work. When we witness incidents that involve vandalizing, incidents when Jewish heritage is being destroyed, or anti-Semitic graffiti is being sprayed over walls, then of course the governments have to, or at least we would assume that governments have to respond in a way. But those responses are not infrequently going in the other direction, namely, let's send a positive message. And that very strong positive message is about the scale of financial support the governments are giving to preserve, refurbish, restore, and maintain synagogues or Jewish cemeteries. And that, of course, has to be appreciated. It's a super important task. And I couldn't imagine anyone saying that's not important, but that is not enough. And that, if put in the spotlight, that in a way deflects our attention from the ills that have to be addressed. So the financial support that the Jewish communities in Central Europe are receiving is definitely something that has to be done and appreciated, but it has to be matched by educational efforts, and those efforts have to be made by governments. There might be a separate discussion about how governments are handling the question of education about their Jewish communities, education about World War II. In Central Europe, this is still a sensitive issue. This is still an issue that both governments and whole societies are grappling with. And it's going up and down. It's not a steady process. I could not say that Central European societies have been steadily moving forward, upward and forward, becoming more and more mature, more and more capable of facing even the most difficult chapters of their history. Just recently, we heard from the Lithuanian Prime Minister something that I'm not sure most political leaders and decision makers would be able of saying out loud. And what the Prime Minister said was that it takes a mature society to be able to face even the most painful parts of their history. And in Central Europe, that most painful part of our history is definitely World War II and the Holocaust. So even if government agencies were able and willing to cover the question of education when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism and providing knowledge about the Jewish community to their school children, there still is the question of what kind of knowledge would be provided, and whether the narratives that would be offered would be honest enough. I'm actually asking a question. I'm not saying this is impossible, but again, what we are witnessing in some of the countries in Central Europe, and this is not something that started very recently. It's a long-standing issue. I cannot say that the quality of educational materials when it comes to World War II is satisfactory. There have been leaps, I would say. There have been successful attempts at trying to help children face the difficult World War II history, but it's still, I have to say, an exception rather than the rule. We can see examples of those lacks in the process of education, very often, of course, not only in Central Europe, but the world over and in the whole of Europe. Just recently, there was a case of 12-year-olds who destroyed more than 60 Jewish graves because they wanted to build a fortress. It only testifies to a horrible lack of education, not only with the children themselves, but also with their parents, with the schools. So we have to be asking this question: where's this education? And it's not only about the history of European Jews; it's also education against hatred and inclusive education about respect for other people. We have seen in Central Europe graveyards even untouched during World War II, which is of course a rare case, a very rare case. We have seen these untouched graveyards that were vandalized just recently, a few years ago, not by German soldiers or by the SS, not by any military or occupation forces. This is happening almost as we speak. And again, it's not only Germany or the Netherlands. We all read about these incidents in Western Europe. It's a rising problem, or a problem that still remains a challenge in Central Europe, and it's definitely a sign of deficiencies in the respective educational systems. The last major issue I want to focus on, I want to call it condoning anti-Semitism. Professor Magid said about a level or a degree of acceptance for anti-Semitism, and I think this is a crucial question. There is hardly a place under the sun that would be totally immune to anti-Semitism, where there would be no anti-Semitic incidents or no anti-Semitic hate speech in the public square. But the key question is, what's the reaction to that? What's the reaction on the grassroots level, and what's the reaction among decision makers? And I'm going to focus basically exclusively on the top level decision makers. Violent, hateful language has become accepted. It has become part of what is okay to say in public. It was not always so. It's a negative shift, what we call political correctness. It's definitely not a perfect tool of shaping social behavior, but it can at least serve as a filter, let's say, what can and cannot or cannot be said in public because it might hurt somebody or a whole group. So this political correctness, this tool that spares others from being labeled in a negative way, this seems not to be working. Maybe in Central Europe it actually never worked perfectly, but what we are seeing, I'm afraid, in Central Europe generally, is that it has become okay to say things that are negative stereotypes pertaining to whole groups, be that Jews or Roma people or homosexuals. Somehow, the public arena has become used to this kind of language, and we have to ask the question of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to react, or on whose shoulders does the responsibility fall for not reacting, or not reacting in an effective way? One of my predecessors, I think, mentioned the quite recent FRA Fundamental Rights Agency, an EU agency survey, the survey conducted back in 2019. One of the questions that the survey asked was, do you think your country's government is doing enough, or is being successful in addressing the question of anti-Semitism? And Poland and Hungary, for example, the only two Central European countries to be in the survey, Poland and Hungary fared really poorly in the whole survey, but particularly as far as this question was concerned. Between 80 and 90% of those polled answers definitely not, or rather not. This was their answer to the question whether the government is effectively combating anti-Semitism. So I'm afraid this is part of the answer to the question of responsibility and whether governments are acting responsibly facing anti-Semitism in our part of Europe. It's not only about politicians and those who make decisions on the top level. It's also about any elected officials and law enforcement institutions and police officers. It is up to them to send a clear message that in facing an incident, they should be saying this is a violation of the law. This will not go unpunished, rather than it's even worse in the West. It's even worse in Western Europe. Unfortunately, sometimes this is what we hear when things go wrong in Central Europe. Why is it so important to react to hateful words? Why is it so important not to stop at hinting at Western Europe? Burning synagogues, Jews being killed on the streets, that's not here. It's not a good answer. Why? Because you never know when hateful words will be translated into acts of violence. What we do know, we know that from history, that words do have consequences and words do lead to actions. The fact that physical violence is not physical violence vis-a-vis Jews is not a major problem for Jews in Central Europe does not mean that this may not change in the coming years. And of course, this is something that we would all like to avoid, but it's always better to prevent than try to react after things have gone wrong. That's why hateful language should not be taken lightly by governments. That is why we would expect from governments to be more proactive in countering anti-Semitism in the public arena before words turn into attacks that harm not only our sensitivities, our identities, and our dignity, but before these attacks become an actual threat to our physical safety. So to close my remarks, when we talk about anti-Semitism in Central Europe, it's a bittersweet story. It's definitely not a one-dimensional picture. On the one hand, we do see governments being involved in supporting Jewish communities, but we also would like to see these governments being more actively countering anti-Semitism, even when it's seen only in words and language. And I think we will have questions from the floor. If there are, I will be happy to answer them. And I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Rejak, for delivering this speech. And now the floor is open for any questions from the audience.
I'd like to come back on something that Shaul Magid said. I'm not going to discuss the state of anti-Semitism in the U.S. or just but there's a point on what Shaul Magid said about the Pittsburgh killing that I would like to discuss because I think it's misleading. When you say, Shaul, when you say that the Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life Synagogue was chosen because it's a liberal synagogue dealing with migrants, it's true, but the conclusion of that may not necessarily be that the act was both racist and anti-Semitic in the sense that you seem to mean it is. I'll take an example. 1 year after the Pittsburgh's killing, there was a killing in a mosque in New Zealand by Brenton Tarrant that killed 49 Muslims there. In his manifesto, Brenton Tarrant explained very clearly that he had nothing against the Muslims per se. He had everything against the migrants, the migration, the global movement, the global migrations in general. And what he said was that these mass migrations were organized by the Jews. And so therefore his killing of Muslims in New Zealand was at the root of it an anti-Semitic act. So I mentioned Tarrant because Tarrant actually quoted Robert Bowers, who was the killer of the Pittsburgh killings. He quoted him as an inspiration. So what I'm trying to say here is that, and by the way, this is a classical rhetoric from the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan and other right-wing groups that you find among the Islamist groups today, that the globalism is basically a Jewish plot. The Klan goes as far as saying that even slavery, and in that they agree with Nation of Islam and other anti-Semitic groups, that slavery was organized in the US to destroy the Christian civilization, and it was organized by the Jews. This is the Klan rhetoric. So the notion that, you know, to believe that, I don't know how to put it exactly, but to believe that there's an equivalence between racism and anti-Semitism, and it's all the same fight. It's both true and not so true. What I think we're facing is since the last at least 20 years and probably more, is a rise of global populism that takes many different forms according to the geographic region. It can take a Muslim form and then it's called Islamism. It can take a far right form that is apparently seemingly more classical form that we're more used to as Westerners. But this is the same global wave that wants to destroy everything that has to do with modernity. And at the roots of this fight against modernity, there is the fight against the Jews, because Jews are being seen as the embodiment of modernism, if you will. So if you see it that way, the Pittsburgh's killing is indeed an anti-Semitic killing, and it's not just because the synagogue is a liberal synagogue involved in migrants, in helping migrants. It's an anti-Semitic killing because it aims at destroying something that has to do with what Robert Bauer sees as the modern world, which is the world of migration, of mutation, of change, constant change, and with which the Jews are identified. That's basically all I have to say. But I think we should I just think we should be careful in minoring anti-Semitism as a racism among other racism. There is a specificity in anti-Semitism. It's a form of hate that speaks to the mind, that appeals to the mind, especially in times of crisis, because it's a hate that has to do with knowledge. It's a form of understanding the world. If you hate blacks or Arabs or Chinese or whatever, you just hate them. It doesn't explain to you the nature of the world you're in. If you hate the Jews, you hate the Jews because they are the key factor to what's going wrong in your world and in the world at large. So it's the Ur hatred, if you will. It's the hatred that determines every other hatred. It's the hatred that explains everything in the world. In that sense, it's a form of epistemology. It's not just a hate. It's a form of, it's really, that's why anti-Semitism and fake news are linked in a certain way, because it gives you a certain vision of the world. It teaches you something when you hate Jews. It's not just a hate. It's really a form of knowledge, you know. So that's all I have to say. But I thought it was necessary to rectify that about the Pittsburgh synagogue.
Yeah, if I may follow up on what you just said, Mark, I think what's often a mistake is to not to see the ideological dimension of anti-Semitism. And I think you clearly pointed this out. And all these, if you look at Islamists, if you look at people who voice that in forms of the extremist right or populist right, or among the political left, if you voice it in forms of anti-Zionism, if you don't look at the ideology where the people are coming from, look at their worldview, then you just don't see any anti-Semitism. And Shaul Magid gave a great example of that you just don't see it if you look at anti-Semitism as a form of discrimination or in power structure or something. This is specific to anti-Semitism. This is different to racism. And I would like to challenge Sebastian a little bit, and maybe you want to respond to that. So when you're saying that there is a kind of liberation of anti-Semitic rhetoric, I see that, yes, in parts, but also organizations, even in Germany, the political party where most neo-Nazis organize themselves, the NPD, the National Party of Germany, they have a statement on their website. I just looked it up. Again, I wrote about it some years ago, but it's still up there. And they say, the NPD is not an anti-Semitic party. There must be no ban on criticism, especially when it comes to politically explosive issues that free debate is punished. So even the NPD, even these, not Bauers and not the terrorists from Halle, right? But the organized far-right, extreme right organizations, they declare, because the narrative is such, they declare not to be anti-Semitic. And Linda Sarsour is also a clever politician, and she might have some anti-Semitic ideology, but she, of course, wants to be seen as not anti-Semitic. So when we just say there is now, and that's what Sebastian, you said, well, there is this more and more open anti-Semitic rhetoric. Yes and no, I see it. So in some respect, we still have this after the Second World War. It's not legitimate anymore to be openly anti-Semitic. You're ostracized, and Shaul Magid had a point there to say, well, you cannot really openly voice your anti-Semitic feelings, otherwise you're not part of the society anymore. So there is a point. But still, in some ways, we see, especially on social media, very open anti-Semitic and often in conspiracy theories. So I think what I see, but maybe I would really like to hear what you have to say on that. I see it more like the ideology comes more open and people express that more open. But most people are still hesitant to really say we hate Jews. So they formulate it in some other ways. And even in the rhetoric from the especially populist right, but even in the far right, then they come to this great replacement theory, like what Marc was just referring to, and make Jews responsible for this. But often then they cover it, as the terrorists in Halle partly did, speaking of the ZOGs, the Zionist occupied government. Even among this most, we have some rhetoric that tries a little bit to cover up. So Sebastian, I would really like to hear how you see this development in like seeing this, the rhetoric more openly, in which spheres you see that. We're really interested in that.
Yeah, thank you, Günther. What you have alluded to, or giving the example of NPD, is what I think is a very good example where the differences lie between Western Europe and Central Europe, or Germany in particular, because of history simply, and to what extent Germany has internalized and has come to terms with the Holocaust. I could talk for hours about what is going on in Central Europe, including in Poland. Just a few weeks ago, as we were witnessing with terror the clash between Israel and Hamas, you had a whole wave of anti-Israel demonstrations throughout Europe. Fewer of them in Central Europe, but still a few, including in Warsaw. Just outside the Israeli embassy in Warsaw, there was this small crowd, just a few dozen people, member of a legally registered political party. I'm not sure they ever got to the parliament, but they are, like, de facto, they are a political party, a far-right party, really inspired by Mussolini, and they are super open about this on their websites. What were the slogans they were shouting? Israel should be eliminated. Bombs should be dropped on Israel. And when you read their statements, there's a lot then about Jews being the major ill of this world. So they are not even shying away from saying, yes, we see Jews, including Zionist Jews, as the or problem of this world. This is not only a difference between let's say Germany and Central Europe, it's also a difference between Poland as of today and Poland, let's say 10, 15 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, it would be quite unthinkable to say these things openly. You know, you would use dog whistling, you would wink your eye, you would say, you know who, the big lobby. Now, because these far-right organizations, they have seen a lack of strong response from the decision makers, they feel this is okay. Okay, this can go unpunished, and we can be more explicit in what we're preaching.
If I can respond to a couple of points, to Marc's point, I see Marc left for a moment. Hopefully, he'll come back. I think that it's certainly true, as I said, that there's no doubt that Pittsburgh obviously was an anti-Semitic act. The question the question was, why did this person choose that synagogue and not another synagogue? It's closer to him. And the reason that he gave was the support of Hayas, which was a kind of obviously an organization that aids immigrants from African countries. And this was in the heyday, or I should say, this was in the midst of the anti-immigration animus that was being promulgated by President Trump. So again, this is what I meant by saying that it was not only anti-Semitic, but it was also racist. It's not to say that it was equally anti-Semitic and racist. It's to say that, yes, in a sense, this particular person saw this synagogue, and maybe the Jews more generally, as being part of the problem in aiding immigrants from African countries. But I have to really take issue with something else that Marc said, was that I'm very resistant to the notion of anti-Semitism as the or hatred. I think the distinction between anti-Semitism, the way it is depicted, both in this conference that I've seen and elsewhere, the distinction between that really emerges with Houston Stewart Chamberlain's Foundations of the 19th Century, the notion of the Jews running the world. You don't find that in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world. Certainly not in that way. You find an anti-Judaism. You find the Jews as the Christ killers. You find the Jews as, in a certain sense, that which is, the despised, excluded religion. But you don't find the notion of this global conspiracy theories at all before the 19th century, not in Islam and not in Christianity. So in a way, what I want to say is, however, what you do find much more prominently before modernity is the notion of anti-Blackness. And that's why critical race theory is so important, because it's not about racism. It's about it's the Black as the other of Western civilization. That goes back to the beginning of the slave trade in the 14th and 15th centuries. You can see it in literature in Portugal, in Spain, in France, throughout the European world. Anti-Blackness goes further back in terms of the idea of the Black as the other, as the human other or non-human other, in ways that you just don't see. You have a demonization of Jews, for sure. You have a demonization of Jews as theologically, but the notion of the Jew, quad Jew, you don't find before the 18th century. And that's something that David Neer...
What about the Inquisition?
The Inquisition, again, this was about Judaizers. These was about new Christians who...
I don't think you have the facts right here.
Yes, excuse me.
This is not making sense.
Look, there was pure blood theory in Spain in the Middle Ages. The Inquisition was about new Christians who were secretly practicing Judaism. That was what the Inquisition was about. It wasn't about the Jews. It was about the Jewish conversos who were secretly practicing Judaism and trying to influence Christians toward Jewish practice.
So, okay, just a few minutes. The Inquisition was about the Inquisition was born out of the conversion of the Jews. Because the Jews had become Christians, they became a danger. They were seen as a danger because you couldn't distinguish them from the Christians. Why was that? That's when the purity of the blood was born. Because you couldn't distinguish the Jews from the Christians, you had to distinguish them by other ways. In other words, if you see the Inquisition as the first reaction to modernity, it was the first step of a systematic racism, and it was directed against the Jews as emblematic of what was most distinctive in modernity, which was the possibility to become something else than what you were. So what I'm saying is that there's an element in modernity that has nothing to do with race, that has nothing to do with the color of the skin. It has to do with the mutability of the being, the possibility for someone to become someone else, something else. And that's what the Jews represent in the dynamic of modernity. If you're trying to tell me that there was no anti-modern
Excuse me, whoa.
anti-Semitism before modernity was invented, we'll agree, of course, there couldn't be. But that doesn't mean that there was no anti-Semitism as soon as modernity was invented. In the first
And Marc,
step,
if I can jump in here, excuse me,
Yeah,
just a
sure.
moment. Whoa. Excuse me. This is getting to be an incredibly interesting debate, but it's also a debate that may go on for quite a while. So
Yes.
our time is running very, very short at this point. So if I could ask, we could conclude it here. I'll thank you all very, very much, because this was fascinating, and it's something we can start the next conference on, and we'll begin with this. But for now, thank you all very, very much for taking part. But we just have run out of time. So thank you, and have a good day in America, evening in Europe, and thank you all very much. And for us, we are very much at the close of the conference, so I wanted to add a few words in summation of what we've seen so far. Over the last 2 days, we've heard a variety of voices from the Hungarian Jewish community, from Hungarian and foreign scholars and NGOs, and from the Hungarian government as well. There are some common themes that have emerged, as well as some disagreements. Before turning to these, however, I want to say a few words about how this conference came about. Some months ago, while the lockdown was still in effect, there was a discussion at the Danube Institute Research Center about what research under the circumstances was really possible. István Kiss offered the suggestion that anti-Semitism in Hungary would be an interesting topic. I was immediately sold on the idea and began to do some preliminary research which brought to light how unique the Hungarian situation in many ways really is. This was followed while I was in the US with some Zoom interviews, most notably with Rabbi Andrew Baker of the AJC in New York and Professor Yehuda Hartman, both of whom are with this conference today. The original idea was to publish a report, but as the research went on, I thought we should organize an international conference on the topic, a suggestion that the Institute accepted in principle, though planning a non-virtual conference seemed chaotic at the time. But with the support of the Bocciani Foundation, we went ahead with the planning and hoped for the best. The rest, as historians are fond of saying, is history. The subtitle of the conference, Appearance and Reality, was a reflection of the perceptions that I brought to Hungary from the US, as juxtaposed with the complex realities that emerged from the interviews with the Hungarian Jewish community and more thorough study of academic and popular sources here in Hungary. The perception I brought was largely gleaned from the Western media and think tanks. The two tropes that were most prevalent was that Hungary, in particular the Hungarian government, was deeply anti-Semitic and so opposed to democracy that the parliament had been shut down to allow for dictatorial power even before the first wave of the pandemic reached Hungary. To my surprise, when I arrived, the Hungarian parliament was in fact open for business. While even a cursory statistical examination suggested that contemporary Hungary conspicuously lacked the kind of communal and anti-Semitic violence that has become all too commonplace in other EU countries and indeed in the United States as well. The reasons for this dichotomy between appearance and reality constitute the major subtext of this conference, which we will examine in greater depth presently. In 2020, the European Parliament, in agreement with the Pew Research Center, noted that the Jewish population of Europe is declining, with the primary factor being emigration to Israel in response to anti-Semitic violence in member countries. Hungary is currently little affected by this trend, with the Jewish population estimated at between 47,000 and 65,000, with a Mazahis estimate ranging as high as 100,000. But the real question is who is doing the counting and who is being counted. An interview with Professor András Kovács, who could not be with us at this conference, unfortunately, shed a good deal of light on the problem. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, With orthodoxy nearly destroyed and the remnants emigrated, no more than 10% of Hungarian Jews aligned with any religious community, while long-standing assimilationist tendencies reasserted themselves. In terms of measurables, in 2020, only 12,000 Jews paid the voluntary tax to Jewish groups, and only perhaps 1% of Jews actually attend synagogue regularly. Thus, while the Jewish population in Hungary is quite large, the number of active Jews is actually quite small. From cold statistics emerge remarkable and remarkably Hungarian personal life stories that are at the core of our research. But before turning to these, another statistic is of note. Genetic research indicates that Hungarians have a greater degree of Jewish blood than any other country in the world save Israel. This hidden fact helps to explain the surprising number of Hungarian Jews who were unaware that they were actually Jewish until quite late in life. In the interviews and background research we have done so far, some areas of broad agreement have emerged. First and foremost, anti-Semitism is much less prevalent in Hungarian public life today than it was a decade ago, with the rise of Jobbik and the call for a Jewish list in the Hungarian parliament. A part of this perception is the increasing sense of physical security reported by Hungarian Jews, with only one violent incident reported in the last 2 years. At the same time, many do report that they have been subjected to or overheard anti-Semitic remarks or jokes. And for some, a sense of potential insecurity remains, with Holocaust memories a part of this. We seem fine then, too. History is thus important in a number of ways. During the early communist period, a number of surviving Jews, believing the promise of a classless society, no longer divided by ethnicity, faith, or creed, or something like that happening. Sorry about that. No longer divided by ethnicity, faith, and creed, joined the Communist Party and raised their children without ever telling them of their Jewish heritage or the horrors of the past. Some of these children never learned of their heritage, while others learned quite by accident. This aspect of history is a double-edged sword, playing into anti-Semitic tropes internationally that blame Jews for communism. How deeply rooted this canard actually is was brought home to me only a few weeks ago. I collect Soviet-era propaganda posters. I have lots of them. I love them. And while at the flea market in Budapest, I stumbled on a poster that I just had to have. It was Russian in origin and used the typical artistic motifs of the Stalinist era. It depicted a peasant and a worker, yoked together and under the whip of a typical Soviet commissar. The poster reads, in Russian, "Peasants and workers, this is Soviet freedom." I thought, great, a rare piece of samizdat. Only after I took it home and studied it more closely did I see that the lock on the yoke constraining the peasant and the worker bore the Star of David. The meaning was abundantly clear. But if many Hungarian Jews feel that overt and public expressions of anti-Semitism are declining, proscribed both by law and by popular opinion, how to explain the depiction of Hungary as dangerously anti-Semitic from the outside? The case against Hungary, which can be found in the Western press and elite discourse, follows two primary tributaries. In Israel, the collective memory of Hungarian Holocaust survivors remains strong and continues to shape popular perceptions of Hungary. The close diplomatic relationship between Israel and Hungary, and the even closer relationship between Prime Ministers Orbán and Netanyahu, played exceedingly well on the Israeli right, but in the slightly more than 50% of Israelis who detest the former Prime Minister, the imagery is less sanguine. The Israeli view will, of course, change and evolve over time, but archetypal beliefs change more slowly than ongoing political trends. In the US, the case is more complex. There is little or no popular awareness of Hungarian Holocaust history. Rather, the view of Hungary is shaped by the memory of the Cold War. 1956 is the dominant theme, and it's reinforced by the many Hungarian refugees who came to the West in the wake of the Soviet invasion. Hungarians are thus seen as the brave freedom fighters who stood against Soviet oppression. The evidence presented against Hungary, therefore, is much more contemporary in nature. The casus belli in this indictment centers on the George Soros campaign. The short-lived poster campaign and some of the more extreme rhetoric did seem to have an element of classical anti-Semitism. What has come out of this research, however, is that in contrast to the Western press, very few Jews we have interviewed believe that the Soros campaign was in fact anti-Semitic, either in intent or execution. With only a few exceptions, the Soros campaign is seen by those we have interviewed as entirely political. And moreover, neither the rhetoric surrounding his activities nor the anger expressed by members of the public is seen as having any real connection to the Jewish community in Hungary, whatever. This view, though, was lost on the Western media or simply ignored. Rather, the charge of Hungarian anti-Semitism became an element in a wider critique of what has come to be called illiberal democracy, and could thus be rolled into an indictment of conservative parties across Europe, and could then be equated with fears that the Trump administration constituted a threat to American democracy as well. This media-driven view of Hungary as anti-Semitic and anti-democratic, however, has not taken deep root in the US. And after the events in Washington on 6 January, it's drawn increasing little public interest. Rather, the joke heard in Europe has become increasingly prevalent in the United States. America has always been a missionary culture. Over the years, America has exported Protestant Christianity, free trade, briefly anti-colonialism and anti-fascism, and most of all, anti-communism from the end of World War II until 1989. Underlying all this, however, is the core American faith in democracy as a panacea for all social and political ills. The observation that America has exported so much democracy that they kept too little for themselves is telling. And with that realization, the media focus and the elite discourse which it represents have turned inward, and fears of anti-Semitism and dangers to democracy in Hungary have faded from the headlines. It is hoped that this conference and the publications to follow, an anthology from the conference speakers, and a monograph emerging from the ongoing research will offer Western readers a more nuanced, fieldwork-based view of anti-Semitism in contemporary Hungary that encompasses both perception and reality. Finally, it is customary to close a conference like this with a name check of all who were involved. Given my inability to pronounce Hungarian, this is a perilous but necessary task. What made the conference and the research that it reflects possible was the knowledge and enthusiasm of the researchers who did most of the work and much of the conceptual design. For the passion that they invested in this research, I want to thank, here goes, Tamás Orbán, David Nudge, Zsófia Tothbíró, Lydia Pop, and Sharon Moravi. That wasn't quite right, but it was at least close. Once we had the idea and the grand design, the researchers soon came to the collective realization that we had no idea how to make the conference a reality. The organizational details and the ability to solve each crisis as it arose are what has made these 2 days really possible. I would therefore like to thank Orshoya Milani, Rebecca Illich, Dorina Dosha, and Agnes Berai. Better. Finally, a very special thanks to the man with the phone numbers of seemingly everyone in Budapest when needed, and for sponsoring my stay in Hungary, Professor János Bisenyő, of Oboda University. And another very special thanks to István Kiss, who was the genesis of this study, and John O'Sullivan, president of the Institute. But most of all, I want to express my deep sense of gratitude to the Hungarian Jewish community, who opened their institutions and shared their lives with us in the course of this research. Thanks to all, be safe, and goodbye. Thank you.
Lastly, I will invite István Kiss, Executive Director of the Danube Institute, to deliver his closing remarks.
Thank you, Tamás, and thank you, Jeffrey, for this beautiful speech and giving me a lot of credit in this research. I'm not sure if I deserve all the credit, but thank you. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the Danube Institute, I would like to thank all our speakers today and, of course, yesterday, who could join us and who gave us really important contributions on contemporary and historic Jewish life in Hungary. I would like to thank them for their contribution and of course also for their time and commitment to the event. I think we were very grateful, we could be very grateful and indeed honored that we will be able to host all these many notable figures from across the diverse Hungarian and international Jewish life and community, of course. I believe it's important that we could put aside some of our differences, still could come together and talk about this really important issue together and have these important discussions and debates about this really important topic. I believe we were especially lucky that we could have this event during the COVID crisis and that we could have it basically almost in person. I mean, I know a lot of people were through the internet, but still, I would say most of the speakers could make it and we could have it in person. And because of this, I would also like to thank the Hungarian Academy of Sciences for providing this beautiful venue for us today and, of course, yesterday. I would, of course, also like to thank our colleagues, as Jeffrey has also mentioned, not just the organizational staff, but also all of our researchers who put in tremendous work to make this conference a reality. And of course, last but not least, I would like to thank Jeffrey Kaplan, a distinguished fellow at the Danube Institute, for joining us at the Danube Institute almost a year ago, and for putting all his work into this research, which made this conference a reality in the end. We at the Danube Institute aim to have events just like this, about sometimes controversial topics, but still topics which we should talk about. We believe that it's important to have open and honest discussions on controversial topics such as this. We very much hope that you will walk away from this conference with a better understanding of anti-Semitism historically and currently in Hungary, and having a more clear understanding of this topic. I believe that the presentations here show that this is not a black and white issue, but I hope that they also showed what Jeffrey also mentioned in his speech, that the picture which Hungary is portrayed in the Western, especially progressive media, is sadly quite biased and untrue. While there are, I guess, serious problems, we see that Jewish life today in Hungary is flourishing. Luckily, there are no verbal or physical attacks, or at least really minimal verbal and physical attacks against Jews in Hungary. They can live freely, as His Excellency, the Ambassador of Israel to Hungary, has also mentioned in his speech, and I think in most of the researchers you could see that. Of course, this doesn't mean that there are no problems here in Hungary. We still have a lot of work to do. But I hope that what we also was seen in the research is that the perception of Jewish people here in Hungary that anti-Semitism is actually decreasing in Hungarian society is a good sign, and it shows that we are on a good path. And hopefully, another couple of years from now, when we will have another event such as like this, we will have even more positive stories about anti-Semitism, about fighting anti-Semitism here in Hungary. And one issue, I think, which will merit more attention, which cropped up in a lot of the discussions here, is the question of anti-Semitism, a new form of anti-Semitism perhaps, on the progressive left. I think it's a good question if it's new at all, because as some of the speakers were mentioning, communism had sadly a rich history of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, but here in Hungary as well. So it's a good question if it's new, and also if you look at, for example, the example of Jeremy Corbyn, who was mentioned here previously in the previous panel, who was already being friendly with Islamists in the 80s, shows this is a deep-rooted problem. So hopefully we will have some time to talk about this in the next event. Before closing the conference, please let me promote some of our upcoming events. In July, we are hoping to have at least 2 very important events. One would be an issue launch for our joint journal with the Batthyány Foundation called Hungarian Conservative. And the second really important discussion will be with Stephen Hayward, a really important American journalist, and one of the perhaps most important experts on Ronald Reagan. So once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for all our colleagues to make this conference a reality. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you at one of our next events. Thank you.